Dean Martin was halfway through Everybody Loves Somebody on The Tonight Show when he suddenly stopped singing, put down his microphone, and broke down crying in front of 3 million viewers. For 30 years, nobody knew why the King of Cool lost his composure that night. Then the cemetery groundskeeper revealed the secret Dean had been carrying. It was March 21st, 1988, exactly 1 year to the day after Dean Paul Martin, Jr. had died in that tragic plane crash in the San Bernardino Mountains. Dean Martin was making what would turn out to be his final appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and everyone expected it to be a typical Dean Martin performance, smooth, charming, and effortlessly cool. The audience at NBC's Burbank studio was buzzing with excitement. Dean Martin appearances on Carson were always special events, filled with easy banter, classic songs, and the kind of relaxed chemistry that made for perfect television. At 70 years old, Dean was still a legend, still capable of captivating an audience with nothing more than his voice and his presence. But what the 3 million viewers watching at home that night didn't know was that Dean Martin was carrying a secret so heavy, so painful, that it was slowly destroying him from the inside. And in just a few minutes, that secret would overwhelm him so completely that it would create one of the most shocking moments in television history. The show started normally enough. Johnny Carson introduced Dean with his usual warmth and enthusiasm, and Dean walked out to thunderous applause, looking distinguished in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He seemed relaxed, maybe a little tired, but still very much the Dean Martin that America had loved for decades. The interview portion went smoothly. Dean and Johnny talked about the old days, about Frank Sinatra, about the Rat Pack, about Vegas. Dean was charming and funny, telling stories that had the studio audience laughing and applauding. To everyone watching, this seemed like vintage Dean Martin, a master entertainer at the peak of his powers. But those who knew Dean well could see something different in his eyes that night. There was a sadness there, a weight that hadn't been present in his earlier appearances. His famous smile seemed forced, and his legendary cool seemed to require more effort than usual. When Johnny asked Dean if he'd like to sing something, Dean nodded and walked over to the piano where Doc Severinsen's Tonight Show band was waiting. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, Dean Martin performing one of his classics for a national television audience. Dean had chosen to sing Everybody Loves Somebody, the song that had knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot in 1964 and had become one of his biggest hits. It was a song he'd performed thousands of times, a song so deeply embedded in his muscle memory that he could sing it in his sleep. The band started playing the familiar opening notes, and Dean began to sing in that smooth, effortless voice that had made him famous. Everybody loves somebody sometime. Everybody falls in love somehow. The audience was captivated. Even at 70, Dean's voice was still pure magic, still capable of making every person in the room feel like he was singing directly to them. But as Dean reached the second verse, something began to change. His voice started to waver slightly, and those watching closely could see his hands beginning to shake. Something in your kiss just told me my sometime is now. It was at that moment, as Dean sang the word now, that something inside him broke completely. He stopped singing mid-sentence. The band, confused, continued playing for a few more beats before trailing off into silence. Dean just stood there at the microphone, staring out at the audience with an expression of pure devastation. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, Dean Martin began to cry. Not just a few tears, deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. The King of Cool, the man who had never lost his composure in 40 years of performing, was falling apart on live television in front of 3 million people.
The studio audience fell completely silent. Johnny Carson, who had handled thousands of awkward television moments in his career, looked genuinely stunned. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of Dean's breakdown for the nation to see. Dean put down his microphone, covered his face with his hands, and continued crying. The silence in the studio was deafening. Nobody knew what to do, what to say, or how to handle this unprecedented moment. Finally, Johnny Carson did what he did best. He saved the moment with grace and compassion. Carson walked over to Dean, put his arm around him, and gently led him to the guest chair. He signaled to the band to start playing soft background music, and then he did something that showed why he was the master of television. He treated Dean's breakdown not as an embarrassment, but as a human moment that deserved respect. "Dean," Johnny said quietly, his voice filled with genuine concern, "take your time. We're all friends here." But Dean couldn't compose himself. The tears kept coming, and it was clear that whatever was causing his breakdown wasn't going to be resolved in the remaining minutes of the show. Johnny made a quick decision. He looked directly into the camera and said, "We're going to take a break here, folks. Dean's had a long day, and sometimes we all need a moment. We'll be right back." They went to commercial, and during the break, Dean was helped off stage by Carson's staff. When the show returned, Johnny explained to the audience that Dean wasn't feeling well and had to leave early. It was handled with class and dignity, but millions of people had just witnessed something unprecedented: the complete emotional collapse of one of America's most beloved entertainers. The next morning, the breakdown was front-page news across the country. Television critics, entertainment reporters, and talk show hosts all speculated about what had caused Dean Martin to fall apart so completely. Some said he was drunk. After all, Dean's drinking had been part of his persona for decades, and maybe the alcohol had finally caught up with him. Others suggested he was having health problems, or that he was suffering from dementia or depression. The most common theory was that Dean was simply overwhelmed with grief over his son's death. Everyone knew that Dean Paul Martin Jr. had died in a plane crash the previous year, and everyone knew that Dean had been devastated by the loss. The breakdown happening on the anniversary of his son's death seemed to support this theory.
But while grief over Dean Paul's death was certainly part of what Dean was going through, the real reason for his breakdown that night was far more specific and far more heartbreaking than anyone imagined. The truth would remain hidden for 30 years until a humble cemetery groundskeeper named Henry Martinez finally decided to share the secret he had been keeping since 1987. Henry had worked at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles for over 40 years. He'd seen a lot of celebrities come and go. Marilyn Monroe was buried there, along with countless other Hollywood legends. Henry had always prided himself on being discreet, on respecting the privacy of grieving families, and on never talking to the press about the famous people he encountered in his work. But in 2018, when Henry was 78 years old and nearing retirement, he decided that some stories were too important to take to the grave. "I kept Mr. Martin's secret for 30 years, Henry told a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, "but I think people should know the truth about that night on television. They should know what kind of man Dean Martin really was." According to Henry, Dean Martin had been visiting his son's grave every single week since Dean Paul's funeral in March 1987. Not just occasional visits. Every Thursday, without fail, Dean would arrive at the cemetery at dawn, spend 2 to 3 hours at his son's gravesite, and leave before most people arrived. He didn't want publicity. He didn't want sympathy, Henry explained. He just wanted to be with his boy. He would bring flowers every week, always fresh roses. He would sit on a little folding chair he kept in his car, and he would talk to Dean Paul like he was still there. Henry said that Dean's Thursday morning visits were the most heartbreaking thing he had ever witnessed in 4 decades of cemetery work. Mr. Martin would tell his son about what was happening in his life, about the family, about his work. Sometimes he would sing to him the same songs he used to sing on television, but quietly, just for Dean Paul. And every week he would tell his son how sorry he was. This was the secret that Dean Martin had been carrying, the weight that had been slowly crushing him for almost a year. Dean blamed himself for his son's death, and his weekly visits to the cemetery had become a ritual of grief and guilt that was destroying him emotionally.
But there was more to the story. Henry revealed that on the morning of March 21, 1988, the day of Dean's Tonight Show appearance, something special had happened during his cemetery visit. That morning, Mr. Martin was there longer than usual, Henry remembered. He was talking to Dean Paul about how much he missed him, about how he wished he could have protected him. And then he started singing Everybody Loves Somebody to him, like it was a lullaby. According to Henry, Dean had told his son that night's television appearance would be dedicated to him, and that he would sing Everybody Loves Somebody as a way of sharing their special connection with the world. Mr. Martin said to his son, "When I sing this tonight, you'll know it's for you. Wherever you are, you'll know your old man is thinking about you." But when Dean got to the Tonight Show that evening and started singing the song he had sung to his son's grave just hours earlier, the emotion became overwhelming. The connection between that morning's private moment and the evening's public performance was too powerful, too painful for even Dean Martin to handle. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't sick, he wasn't confused, Henry explained. He was a father who missed his son so much that he couldn't finish a song without breaking down. Henry's revelation finally explained not just Dean's breakdown that night, but his entire emotional state during his final years. The weekly cemetery visits, the gradual withdrawal from public life, the sense of profound sadness that seemed to follow him everywhere. It all made sense once people understood the depth of Dean's grief and guilt. The groundskeeper also revealed that Dean's visits to the cemetery continued right up until his own death in 1995. Even when he was too weak to drive himself, he would have someone bring him to Westwood Village Memorial Park every Thursday so he could spend time with his son. "The last time I saw Mr. Martin at the cemetery was about a month before he died," said Henry. He could barely walk, but he insisted on visiting Dean Paul one more time. He sat in that same folding chair, held his son's headstone, and told him he'd be seeing him soon. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, Henry Martinez was one of the cemetery workers who helped prepare his grave. Dean was buried just a few plots away from his son, close enough that a father and son who had been separated by tragedy could finally be together again. The revelation of Dean's secret cemetery visits and the real reason for his Tonight Show breakdown changed how people understood his final years. Instead of seeing a man who had lost his edge or succumbed to age and alcohol, people began to understand that Dean Martin had been carrying a burden of grief so heavy that it had slowly broken him. The 3 million people who watched Dean Martin break down on live television that night in 1988 had witnessed something far more profound than a celebrity having a bad moment. They had seen a father's love so deep and a grief so overwhelming that it could not be contained, even by a man famous for his unshakable cool. Henry Martinez's decision to finally reveal Dean's secret after 30 years showed the world that behind the smooth persona and easy charm was a man capable of the deepest love and the most profound pain. Dean Martin's breakdown on The Tonight Show wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered human emotion that revealed the heart of a man who had lost the most important thing in his world. The cemetery groundskeeper who had watched Dean Martin's weekly ritual of love and loss finally gave the world the truth about that shocking television moment.
And in doing so, he showed that sometimes the most powerful performances happen not on stage, but in the quiet moments when we think nobody is watching.